Balance nightmares are a dime a dozen in this day and age of League. We usually have at least one of them per year, even with the lower amount of releases as of late. Just recently, Smolder's been in contention for being the next OP champion, having some of the highest pick and ban rates the bot lane has ever seen. But in the past, we've had champs like Cassante, Zeri, Viego, and whatnot go through dozens of patches before they could even remotely be considered stable. This is obviously as a result of Riot trying to nerf them to not be overpowering, while buffing them in ways to keep them relevant in the meta so as not to turn them into another Ryze or Azir who stays permanently at bottom tier win rate. 2 years ago, I covered Zeri's extremely turbulent maiden voyage and how she went through more balance adjustments in 1 year than others have in 5 or even 10. There's one other champion released around that time who, albeit less conspicuously, has been dealing with a similar problem. The only difference is that unlike most other delinquent champions who received a combination of buffs and nerfs, this little has gotten almost exclusively nerfs, and yet still manages to be a dominant presence in the jungle, with their win rate and pick and ban rate measurably increasing around Platinum Plus, meaning this isn't just a challenger type situation. Her infection festers the entire top half of the solo queue ladder. For today, we'll be discussing Bel'Veth, how she's able to remain strong despite the countless bombardment of nerfs received during her tenure. Belveth is a controversial champion for many reasons. Some dislike her gameplay design, as the experience of a manta ray slapping you doesn't lend itself to the narrative expectation of the self-proclaimed Queen of the Void. Others find her to be one of the most boundary-overstepping champions in the game, and subsequently a very obvious red flag. At a surface glance, Belveth's moveset may appear complicated by the sheer length of text in each of her abilities, but in terms of application, it's surprisingly digestible. Passive makes her next 2 attacks faster whenever using an ability, Q is a dash that deals damage to enemies she passes through, and she can store a dash in each of the cardinal directions. W is a straight line knockup that grants her a dash in that direction if it's already down. E is a channel that reduces incoming damage and rapidly attacks the nearest enemy. Ultimate gives her bonus true damage every other attack, and if she scores a takedown, she can blast everyone with true damage and gain bonus stats. Of course, you have to make a mental note of all the different on-hit effect mechanics associated with them, but if you're trying to explain this to a brand new player in layman's terms, she's not the most complicated champion in the game, even from a mechanical standpoint. Yet, in spite of this, Bel'Veth has been given the moniker of 200 years just as often as Yone, Cassante, Viego, Zeri, and such. Not only by us the players, but from Riot themselves, it appears. Having been released back in version 12.11, Bel'Veth has been featured in 7 patches between then and the present day. Of those 7, 6 of them produced a net negative for the champion. A number of them had a mixture of buffs and nerfs, but they were for the most part intended to reduce the champion's efficiency overall, hence the net negative. While uncommon, there do exist champions that have consistently gotten buffs over the years but have yet to reach a positive win rate. You can learn more about them in my video on power creep champions, but to briefly summarize, champs like Teemo, Veigar, Kennen, and Malphite were sequentially buffed over the years to account for their mundane one-dimensional kits that, aside from maybe one ability, amounted to fairly limited room for skill expression, necessitating that buffs be routinely administered to them so as to keep up with the growing pace and complexity of League's gameplay. On the opposite end, having this high of a nerf percentage is almost unprecedented for any champion, especially one who has retained a positive win rate in spite of all that. 12.12 oversaw an increase to her base attack range, which is a buff, but they compromised by flatlining the range from Endless Banquet. Her health regeneration per level got reduced, passive stacking was made lower at higher levels, Royal Maelstrom lost minimum base damage and lifesteal, and Endless Banquet lost missing health true damage, the aforementioned bonus attack range, and reduced minion HP. Later that same patch, a hotfix was given to reduce her AD and health growth, lifesteal from Royal Maelstrom even further, along with an increased cooldown at higher ranks, and Endless Banquet lost bonus health scaling and healing. Towards the end of the year, in 12.21, her Maelstrom cooldown was increased yet again across all levels, and the health of her Void Remras was reduced once more. 13.9 continued with more nerfs by lowering her attack damage growth again. Though this was accompanied by 20% bonus damage to monsters, it reduced her pressure against champions, which is a net negative as monster damage becomes less significant after the first and second clear. 13.20 is where I had the thought of making this video in the first place, as this will mark the 5th consecutive patch of nerfs for Bel'Veth, and quite a measurable one at that. The bonus attack speed on her next 2 autos after casting an ability was cut down. Meanwhile, Royal Maelstrom was significantly nerfed, losing almost half its damage reduction at rank 1 and a ton of on-hit base damage in exchange for better AD scaling, missing health scaling, and gaining the ability to crit. Overall though, I'd consider this a nerf for the champion, as you wouldn't get to reap the benefits of the buff side of things until the mid to late game, while you most certainly felt the sting of her now weaker early game. 13.21 finally ended the streak by reverting a portion of the cooldown nerfs to her E. The celebration was short-lived however, when a few months later, just recently in 14.5, she got even less damage reduction. Granted, these aren't the harshest nerfs in the world. I've seen some that completely gutted a champion, driving them to the point of unplayability, but I'll remind you that the point of interest is more about the fact that Bel'Veth still has a win rate above 50% in Platinum Plus, and in Masters Plus, she still has no trouble reaching above 52. One can only imagine how strong she must have been at full power back in 12.11. I recall seeing tier lists back then and there being somewhere around 56% win rate, which is insane. How is the champion able to consistently get nerfed and yet stay broken? These aren't slaps on the wrist either, like dropping 5 movement speed on Irelia. Again, they're not the worst I've seen, but they're fairly significant, notably the ones given to Royal Maelstrom. Belveth is an infinite scaler. More importantly, she's an infinite scaler without a permanent weakness. I've mentioned in the past that even though the thought of a champion having no limits to how strong they can get seems terrifying, most if not all scalers are kept in check by having, among other things, a weakness that remains in effect no matter how many stacks they have. In other words, their infinite scaling mechanic has diminishing returns in that past a certain point, more of that stat doesn't really make that much of a difference. For example, Nasus can have 10 stacks or 1000, but it doesn't change the fact that he's a short-range, single-target, immobile juggernaut who can still get kited and beaten down from a distance. Sion can have 1000 or 100,000 HP and he still can get shredded by tank busters with % health damage. Veigar can have 150 AP or 1500 AP and he'll still be vulnerable to hard engage or long-range poke. That's the fault of infinite scalers. They can improve limitlessly in one area, but that will have no effect on the areas they actually suffer from, with said blind spots being insurmountable through skill alone. Being an infinite scaler without a clear weak point, Belveth gets the privileges that come with infinite scaling without the negative consequences of having such a power. For starters, she's hyper, and I emphasize hyper mobile. 5 dashes if we include the extra one refresh by above and below. This alone bypasses one of the key limiters imposed on infinite scalers, the ability to easily exert their pressure. Nasus and Veigar have the potential to one-shot anyone with enough stacks, but they don't have an easy way of guaranteeing that pressure. Belveth, however, does. She can rack up immense amounts of attack speed and on-hit damage, and then get all up in your face to actually utilize all that. Trying to shake off Belveth is quite difficult, as even if you have a dash to get away from her, she can manipulate her movement to essentially allow all 4 directional dashes to get her closer to you. With above and below having a cast range far enough to tag even Caitlyn from max distance, that's a knockup followed by a long-lasting slow that gives her another dash towards you. She has some of the best stick potential in the game. This means that her infinite scaling has more influence in her performance than the likes of Nasus. A 300 stacks Nasus with a dash is much more threatening than a 600 stacks Nasus without one, since you can play outside his range. That's reason 1 why Belveth maintains a high win rate in spite of all the nerfs. You'll notice most of her nerfs apply to everything except her means of access. Less base AD on hit damage, less base damage reduction, flattened scaling curve, etc. Nerfs, yes, but none of them prevent her from executing her game plan. To shut down an infinite scaler, you don't go after the scaling itself, you go after the means of access. You guys remember full AD in Tank Sion, right? The way they shut it down was not by lowering his HP scaling, rather they took away Prowler's Claw, removing an easy way for Sion to get up close and personal. They also nerfed his damage to structures while dead to shut down his guaranteed tower pressure. They didn't touch his W scaling whatsoever. All the nerfs given to Belveth did not in any way diminish her access to infinite scaling, letting her continue doing what she already does. Reducing her DPS or attack speed simply makes it so she needs to get more stacks from her passive and ultimate to make up the difference. The implication is that the opposing team has more time to shut her down in the early game before she gets to that point, but therein lies the second reason behind her continued success even after the nerfs. Attack speed champs are all beholden to the dreaded early game. Master Yi, Kog'Maw, Kayle, AD Shyvana, like other champs, they have to build damage to start impacting a fight, but what makes their early game more exploitable is that on-hit champions are more reliant on item power spikes than any other archetype. For an AD caster like Pantheon, Zed, or Lee Sin, completed items are indeed valuable power spikes, but they can just as easily make use of a serrated Dirk or Caulfield's Warhammer, giving them a linear upward progression. Items with on-hit effects like Rageblade, Wit's End, Blade of the Ruined King, Terminus, and Kraken Slayer differ in a number of ways. Their component items are comparatively weaker in strength than other items. Tiamat, Lost Chapter, Serrated Dirk, these items are generally more threatening on the champions who build them than Recurve Bow, Noon Quiver, and Hearthbound Axe are for their respective buyers. In exchange, the completed items are generally more substantial in terms of impact, if not individually then collectively. On-hit completed items get stronger with more on-hit completed items. For example, if you buy Terminus then buy Rageblade, not only do you get the benefits of Rageblade, but so does Terminus, exponentially increasing your DPS, whereas buying a Black Cleaver doesn't directly strengthen Eclipse. The two items just work separately. That's why Master Yi and Kayle feel so weak early game, but once they get 3 items, they start a**ing everyone. One would assume that Belveth also suffers from the same early game deficiencies as her peers, right? That's the problem, she kind of doesn't. Quite the opposite. Belveth is one of the most infamous predator junglers in the game. In almost every match that she's in, you find her invading to either steal enemy camps or hunt down the enemy jungler. Her combination of 5 dashes, each dealing slightly more damage than a basic attack and applying on-hit effects, and her strong hard CC ability gave her actual gank pressure, which Master Yi and Shyvana don't have. She could actually gank if she wanted to and be pretty effective at it. Secondly, she has, or rather had, actual base pressure in her kit. That's what they've been mostly targeting with the nerfs. Royal Maelstrom used to have unconditional 70% total damage mitigation. 70%. Most dance type abilities in the early game have 30, 40, 50%, Bel'Veth had 70. That same ability also gives her a ton of lifesteal when used, so she comes with a fair amount of base pressure in the kit that most on-hit champions don't have access to. Remember, in the early game, everyone is weak. Assassins, fighters, mages, marksmen, they all suck because no one has items. Once you get a bit of AD, a bit of AP, what have you, then you start to notice which champions have a faster start than others. But in the first 5 or so minutes of the game, it all comes down to abilities and base numbers. Belveth, despite being an infinite scaler, had a ton of base power, excessive amounts at that, which they've more or less brought down to reasonable numbers. Even after the nerfs though, she still has base pressure in her kit from the concept of her abilities. She's the only on-hit melee champion with hard CC. She's the only on-hit melee with a defensive ability that also deals damage. Bel'Veth can be proactive in the early game and is encouraged to do so, unlike most other on-hit champs and infinite scalers who have to sit and pray that they can survive long enough to outscale. The third reason behind her enduring strength is that by being a jungler, Bel'Veth bypasses the single most difficult challenge facing infinite scalers, resistance. While the possibility of you having to confront the enemy jungler throughout the course of a game is very much real, the fact remains that most of the time you're not constantly facing an opponent. With good map awareness and jungle tracking, you can safely farm camps, gank lanes, and scale without ever coming in contact with the opposing jungler at all. Therefore, you can manipulate the circumstances to always be in an advantageous position for you. Essentially, you can't stop Bel'Veth from scaling. She can and will scale. If you play lane correctly, you can pretty much keep Nasus from acquiring even a single stack. You can bully Veigar to where he only generates about 5 AP per minute, and you can wipe the floor with Senna to give her less than 50 stacks at 20 minutes. Technically, you can stop Bel'Veth from stacking by stealing her camps, but as I mentioned in my jungle video, you can't be everywhere at the same time. If you try to invade the enemy Bel'Veth's bot side to steal their camps, she can take her topside camps. Also, you can't zone away the enemy jungler from their camps the entire game, not by yourself anyway. For you to stop a Bel'Veth from farming, your laners have to coordinate to where if say you're ganking bot lane, you're top and mid or checking topside jungle to make sure Bel'Veth doesn't sneak in to take your stuff. Altogether, that means her ability to stack up her passive is all but assured. Bonus attack speed with no attack speed cap gives her extreme DPS scaling, as she also has infinite bonus true damage on her ultimate provided she's attacking a single enemy, so she can even shred bulky champions too. Veigar and Nasus can theoretically acquire infinite damage, but realistically they'll still take a while to break past a Sejuani, Ornn, or Maokai. Bel'Veth, however, is a danger to all types of champions, tanky or squishy. The only way to beat her is to have someone else who can deal just as much DPS as her, or someone who can one-shot her through a single rotation. Preferably with hard CC in it to prevent her from casting Royal Maelstrom like Elise or something. Those are the main reasons why Bel'Veth, despite being consecutively nerfed over and over and over again, has still maintained a positive win rate. Her kit and circumstances are just too good. She's an infinite scaler who basically is guaranteed to scale thanks to being a jungler, therefore having the option to avoid her opponent while still having early game tools to be a threat, all while scaling like a beast and actually being able to use that scaling, which due to being attack speed and on-hit effects, lets her handle just about any champion. She has the best of every world. I feel like the only way they can truly nerf her is by targeting her means of access like I mentioned. She's too mobile. If her uptime was compromised, that would have more benefit. Again, it's not the scaling that's the issue, it's her ability to easily apply that scaling. I find her mobility to be the biggest challenge of dealing with her, less so the damage. There are tons of champions who can out DPS her even back when she was at full power. The problem is, they can't nerf her Q since if they do, that destroys the entire feel of the champion. So they're stuck between a rock and a hard place, where they have to nerf her Q to actually make her weak, but if they nerf her Q, that breaks the champion completely. So they're trying to attack everything else, but none of that matters when she still has 5 dashes and infinite attack speed. Truly, one of the champions of all time. What are your thoughts on Bel'Veth? Do you agree with my stance on the problem with her, or do you think it's a different issue with her entirely? Feel free to share it in the comments. That's gonna be it for today, so if you enjoyed the video, it would be great if you could leave a like and subscribe. Don't forget to follow my Twitter @Vars, join my Discord server, and check out my other discussion videos if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.